The smell of rain-slicked asphalt and cheap grease always hung heavy in the air behind the gilded crane. But tonight, it carried a sharp metallic edge, the scent of gun oil and expensive silk. A cold Brooklyn drizzle cut through the narrow corridor like a serrated knife, chasing the steam rising from the industrial vents. Inside the kitchen there was safety and the clatter of pans. Out here there were only shadows and secrets kept in the dark. Neon signs from the street cast flickering jagged lines of crimson and violet across the damp brick walls. The world outside was a dull roar of traffic, but in this alley, the silence was heavy, waiting for the lightning to strike. Nia Calder moved through the dim light with the practiced stillness of a ghost. Her black uniform was ironed to a sharp edge, her white apron a stark, clean contrast against the urban grime. At 26, Nia had mastered the art of being a shadow in a city of bright lights. It was a survival skill, honed by years of staying beneath the radar of people who didn't want to be found. She balanced a tray of steaming bowls with effortless grace, her eyes lowered but her mind cataloging every detail of the damp alley. The way the light hit the puddle, the heavy rhythmic breathing of the men blocked the exit. She saw everything without looking. The way the man in the lead shifted his weight, the bulge of a holster beneath a tailored blazer, the trembling hands of Mrs. O, clutching a bowl of soup like a shield. The silence that followed Nia's words was heavier than the humid Brooklyn air. The two bodyguards lay on the wet pavement, one groaning, the other unconscious, while the steam from the shattered soup bowl curled around Nia's ankles like a dying breath. She stood perfectly still, her knuckles throbbing, her gaze locked onto Yoon Taekwon. She had just broken the first rule of her existence. Never let them see what you can do. Taekwon didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he took a slow step forward, the expensive leather of his shoes crunching over the jagged ceramic shards of the soup bowl. His dark eyes weren't filled with the expected murderous rage. They were narrow, burning with a cold, clinical curiosity. He looked at the way Nia balanced her weight, the precision of her guard, and then at the defiant set of her jaw. Where did a waitress in a back-alley bistro learn the dialect of the Sejong bloodline? His voice was a low silk rasp, more dangerous than a shout. That is not the language of a servant. It is a challenge. Beside Nia, Mrs. O let out a whimpering sob, her fingers trembling as she clutched Nia's sleeve. The sound anchored Nia back to the stakes of the moment. If she didn't fix this, the old woman would pay for Nia's moment of pride. I learned it from people who knew true honor, Nia replied, her Korean still flawlessly formal, sharp enough to cut. Something you wouldn't find in a rain-slicked alleyway harassing an old woman over a debt that has already been paid in sweat. One of the bodyguards struggled to his feet, his hand reaching for the holster inside his jacket. Sir, let me. Taekwon raised a single hand, a silent command that froze the man in place. He never took his eyes off Nia. He was looking through her, past the black uniform and the stained apron, searching for the ghost of someone he recognized. He saw the lion strike in her posture, a technique that had been extinct in the syndicate for 20 years. You have two choices, Nia Calder, Taekwon said, his tone shifting into something clinical, a verdict being handed down. I can let my men finish what they started, and this alley will be the last thing you and this woman ever see. Or you can come with me. Nia's heart hammered against her ribs. And Mrs. O? She stays. Her debt is paused, not forgiven but paused, Taekwon said, a shadow of a smirk touching his lips. Consider yourself the interest. I want to know who trained a ghost to fight like a king. If you lie to me, or if you try to run, I will return here and burn this bistro to the ground with her inside it. Nia looked at Mrs. O's terrified face, then back at the man who held their lives in his manicured hands. The invisibility she had spent a decade building was gone, incinerated by a single punch and 3 reckless words. She felt the cold metal of the trap closing around her, but as she stepped toward Taekwon's waiting black sedan, she didn't look like a prisoner. She looked like a soldier beginning a long-delayed march. She climbed into the back seat, the scent of expensive cologne and old blood enveloping her. As the car pulled away, leaving the flickering neon of the bistro behind, Nia realized she wasn't just entering the world of the White Dragon. She was returning to the one she had been born to destroy. The black sedan glided through the rain-slick streets of Brooklyn like a predatory shark, eventually pulling into the underground garage of a glass and steel monolith that pierced the low-hanging clouds. Nia sat in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap to hide the slight tremor in her fingers. The interior of the car smelled of cedar and cold power, a stark contrast to the familiar scent of ginger and dish soap she had left behind at the bistro. They ascended in a private elevator that moved with a sickeningly smooth silence. When the doors opened, Nia was ushered into a penthouse that looked less like a home and more like a fortress of glass. The city lights of New York stretched out below them, a million glowing witnesses to a world Nia had spent 10 years trying to avoid. Yoon Taekwon poured himself a glass of amber liquid, the ice clinking against the crystal with the finality of a gavel. He didn't offer her a seat. He simply stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his silhouette sharp against the skyline. "The dialect you used in the alley," he began, his voice devoid of the earlier adrenaline. "It hasn't been heard in the Seoul underworld for a generation. It is the Gungjung-eo, the language of the royal court. My grandfather was the last man I knew who spoke it with that particular inflection of the northern provinces." He turned, his eyes searching hers, looking for a crack in her armor. "A black waitress in Brooklyn shouldn't know how to speak to a man as if he is a peasant in his own house. Who gave you that tongue?" Nia called her. Nia stood her ground, the shadow of the elevator's light carving a sharp line across her face. "My foster mother taught me to speak," she said, her voice steady. "But my father taught me what the words meant. He told me that language is a map of where you've been and a shield for where you're going." Taekwon stepped closer, entering her personal space. The air between them crackled with a strange high-wire tension. "Repeat what you said to me. The last 3 words." Nia didn't flinch. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a low melodic whisper that carried the weight of ancient history. She used a verb ending so archaic, so heavy with authority, it felt like a physical weight in the room. "Juman Myeonchwore," she breathed. "Cease and desist." Taekwon froze. The word wasn't just a command. It was a rhythmic cadence used by the elite protectors of the old dynasties, the men who stood between the king and the blade. It was more pure, more authentic than the jagged modern slang of the syndicate he led. "That is the lion's accent," Taekwon whispered, almost to himself. He reached out, his thumb brushing the fabric of her uniform near her shoulder, just above the heart. The men who spoke like that were legendary for their loyalty, and even more legendary for the way they disappeared when the world turned cold. He stepped back, his expression unreadable, but for the first time, the predatory hunger in his eyes was replaced by a flickering shadow of respect, or perhaps fear. "You aren't a debt to be collected, Nia. You are a ghost that has been haunting my family for 20 years. And I think it's time I found out why." The following morning, the glass fortress of the penthouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like a staging ground. Taekwon had barely slept, his gaze fixed on the digital files of syndicate movements, yet he moved with a restless, coiled energy. He didn't explain where they were going when he ushered Nia into the reinforced SUV. He only muttered that the elders were getting impatient. Nia sat in the back, the crisp fabric of her borrowed silk blouse feeling like a second skin she hadn't yet learned to inhabit. They were traversing the industrial skeletal remains of the Brooklyn waterfront when the atmosphere shifted. The rhythmic thrum of the tires on the asphalt was suddenly drowned out by the scream of a high-performance engine. A gray sedan swerved from a side street, slamming into the SUV's rear quarter panel with a deafening screech of twisting metal. Nia's training kicked in before her conscious mind could register the fear. As the SUV fishtailed, she braced her core, her eyes scanning the perimeter. "Get down," she commanded, her voice ringing with the authority of the royal court dialect even in English. A second vehicle surged ahead, cutting them off and forcing the driver to slam on the brakes. Glass shattered as a hail of gunfire peppered the reinforced windshield. The driver slumped forward, blood blooming like a dark flower against the steering wheel. Taekwon reached for the weapon at his hip, but the SUV was tilted at a precarious angle, pinning his arm against the door frame. "Taekwon, move!" Nia didn't wait for his permission. She lunged across the center console, her movements a blur of calculated violence. She grabbed the dead driver's handgun, her grip firm and practiced. Two gunmen emerged from the gray sedan, their faces masked, moving with the heavy-handed confidence of men who expected no resistance from a waitress. They were wrong. Nia kicked the passenger door open, using the heavy metal as a shield. She didn't fire wildly. She waited for the breath between heartbeats. Two shots rang out, crisp, rhythmic, and devastatingly accurate. The first gunman dropped, hit in the shoulder. The second dove for cover behind a concrete pillar. Left side, 10 o'clock. Nia barked, sensing a third shadow moving through the debris of a nearby warehouse. She reached back, grabbing Taekwon's hand and pulling him with a strength that belied her slender frame, dragging him out of the kill zone and into the cover of a rusted shipping container. Taekwon watched her, his breath coming in sharp gasps, not from fear, but from the sheer shock of the transformation. The woman who had served soup with practiced invisibility was gone. In her place was a predator of terrifying grace, her eyes cold and analytical as she scanned the horizon for more threats. She checked the magazine of the handgun with a flick of her wrist, her thumb tracing the safety with a familiarity that spoke of years of secret drills. "You're not just a ghost," Taekwon whispered, his hand tightening around hers as the sirens began to wail in the distance. Nia didn't look at him. She kept her weapon leveled at the mouth of the alley, her jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. "I told you, Yoon Taekwon. My father taught me that a shield is only useful if you know how to use it. Now let's get out of here before the rest of the pack arrives." In that moment the power dynamic shifted irrevocably. She was no longer a debt to be studied or a curiosity to be toyed with. She was the only reason he was still breathing. The adrenaline from the ambush had cooled into a heavy, suffocating silence by the time they reached a secondary safe house, a brutalist concrete structure hidden beneath the shadow of the Manhattan Bridge. Taekwon walked to a heavy steel safe, his movements jerky, the mask of the untouchable Mafia boss beginning to fracture. Nia stood by the door, her borrowed silk blouse stained with the driver's blood, still holding the handgun with the casual familiarity of a veteran. "You move like a ghost from my grandfather's stories," Taekwon muttered, his fingers flying across a keypad. He pulled out a weathered, leather-bound dossier, its edges yellowed by time and humidity. There was a man, a shadow who walked behind the White Dragon founder during the expansion of the 90s. They called him the Gunwaide, the Royal Guard. But to the streets, he was known as the Black Lion. He spread the contents of the file across a glass table. Nia's breath hitched. There, pinned to a report written in traditional Hanja characters, was a grainy photograph. It was a man who looked exactly like her, standing in a rain-slicked street in Seoul, wearing the same stoic expression she had worn in the alleyway. Behind him, a much younger version of Taekwon's grandfather leaned on a cane, looking more like a brother than a master. "Mitch Calder," Nia whispered, the name tasting like salt on her tongue. "My grandfather's journal says your father didn't just protect the family. He saved the bloodline," Taekwon said, his voice dropping to a low, reverent tone. "During the 98 purge, he took 3 bullets meant for the chairman. In return, my grandfather swore a Joong, a blood oath. He promised that the White Dragon would protect the Calder line for 7 generations." Taekwon looked up, his eyes wide with a realization that bordered on horror. "But after my grandfather died, the records were altered. My father and the council elders claimed the Black Lion had betrayed us, that he had stolen the syndicate's reserves and fled to America. They put a price on his head so high that he had to disappear into the cracks of the world just to keep you alive." Nia reached out, her fingers hovering over the photo of her father. "He didn't steal anything. He left because he found out the council was starting the human trafficking routes. He told me he couldn't be the shield for a family that had become the sword of the devil." The weight of the debt settled between them, thick and undeniable. In the eyes of the old laws, Taekwon wasn't Nia's captor. He was her debtor. His family had thrived on the sacrifice of hers, then rewarded that sacrifice with a lie and a manhunt. "The men who attacked us today, they weren't just rivals," Taekwon said, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "They were sent by the council. They know who you are, Nia. They've known since you opened your mouth in that alley. To them, You are a living confession of their greatest sin. Nia looked at the gun in her hand, then at the man whose ancestors owed her everything. The practiced invisibility of the waitress was officially dead. She was no longer hiding from a mafia boss. She was standing next to one who finally realized he was protected by the daughter of the man his family had betrayed. The blood debt was no longer a story from the past. It was a war that had just arrived at their doorstep. The tension of the safe house was replaced by the low hum of the penthouse's industrial kitchen. It was the only place Nia felt she could breathe. A sterile sanctuary of stainless steel and sharpened knives that reminded her of the world she had just lost. She was meticulously dicing vegetables for a simple juk, porridge for the soul, when she felt his presence behind her. Taekwon didn't approach with his usual predatory stride. He moved like a man carrying the weight of the city on his shoulders. He sat at the marble island, his expensive suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal a jagged scar running from his wrist to his elbow. He looked at the rhythmic motion of Nia's knife, the way she treated the simple ingredients with more respect than his father had ever treated a human life. My father told me that the kitchen was a place for the weak, Taekwon said, his voice barely a whisper against the hum of the refrigerator. He said if you weren't at the head of the table commanding the feast, you were nothing more than the help being consumed by it. Nia didn't stop her work. My father told me the kitchen was the heart of the house. It's where you sustain life, not where you take it. There is more power in a bowl of soup, given to a hungry person than in a bullet fired at an enemy. Taekwon let out a hollow, bitter laugh. I spent my 20th birthday in a basement in Incheon, proving I was strong by breaking the fingers of a man who had stolen a shipment of silk. I didn't want the throne, Nia. I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to build things that stayed up, rather than tearing down the lives of people who got in the way of the white dragon. He reached out, his hand hovering near a sprig of green onion she had just chopped. For a moment, the mask of the cold-blooded mafia heir slipped entirely. His eyes were tired, reflecting a deep-seated exhaustion that went beyond lack of sleep. It was the weariness of a man forced to play a role in a play he hated, written by a father who had valued legacy over love. When I saw you in that alley, he continued, looking directly at her, I didn't just see a waitress who knew how to fight. I saw someone who had managed to do what I couldn't. You escaped. You built a life out of nothing, away from the blood and the shadows. I envied you even as I was threatening you. Nia set the knife down. She saw it then, the vulnerability he kept buried under layers of silk and violence. He wasn't just her father's debtor. He was a prisoner of the same system that had tried to erase her family. The common ground they stood on wasn't just made of old blood oaths, but of shared resentment for the monsters who had raised them. You can still build something, Taekwon, she said softly, her hand momentarily brushing his as she reached for the pot. But you can't build a new house on a foundation of rot. You have to clear the ground first. He looked at her, and for the first time the language of kings wasn't a barrier between them. It was a bridge. In the quiet of the kitchen, amidst the scent of simmering broth, the mafia boss and the waitress found a silent understanding. The war ahead wasn't just about survival. It was about earning the right to finally be human. The return to the Gilded Crane felt like entering a graveyard. The neon sign that usually hummed with a warm, welcoming buzz was dark, and the yellow police tape fluttering against the door was the only thing moving in the stagnant Brooklyn air. Taekwon parked the car several blocks away, and they moved through the shadows of the alleyway where it had all begun, the site of the soup spill that had effectively ended Nia's life as a ghost. Inside, the bistro smelled of stale air and extinguished dreams. Taekwon kept his hand near his weapon, his eyes scanning the shattered glass and overturned tables, but Nia moved with a singular, quiet purpose toward the back of the kitchen. She bypassed the walk-in freezer and the industrial stoves, stopping instead at the heavy, wooden prep station where Mrs. O spent her mornings folding dumplings. My father always said that the most important things are hidden in plain sight, Nia whispered, her voice echoing in the hollow space. She knelt on the floor, her fingers searching for the worn groove in the floorboards that she had scrubbed 1,000 times. She pressed a specific knot in the wood, and with a soft mechanical click that sounded like a heartbeat in the silence, a narrow section of the floor shifted. Taekwon knelt beside her, his breath hitching as he saw what lay beneath. A small steel-lined compartment containing a leather-bound ledger and a series of high-density flash drives wrapped in a plastic seal. Taekwon reached for the ledger, his fingers trembling as he flipped through pages filled with his father's handwriting and the official seals of the council elders. These weren't records of legitimate business. They were logs of human cargo, names, ages, and delivery dates that dated back to the year Nia's father had disappeared. "It's all here," Taekwon said, his voice thick with a mixture of rage and grief. The Black Lion didn't run with the money. He stole the evidence. He was waiting for the right moment to burn them down, but they got to him before he could reach the authorities. Nia pulled out a small tarnished silver locket tucked into the side of the ledger. Inside was a photo of her as a child, held by a man whose eyes were filled with the same weary resolve she saw in the mirror every morning. "He kept this with the evidence," she said, her voice cracking for the first time. "He knew that if they found him, this was the only way I'd ever know the truth. The evidence was a death warrant for the current leadership of the White Dragon. It proved that the elders weren't just criminals. They were monsters who had built their empire on the systematic exploitation of the very people they claimed to protect. They'll be coming for this," Taekwon said, standing up and tucking the ledger into his coat. "The moment we leave this building, the council will know we have the keys to their kingdom." Nia stood beside him, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the kitchen. She looked at the empty restaurant, the place that had been her sanctuary, and realized that the quiet survival she had craved was no longer an option. The secret was out, and the daughter of the protector was finally ready to settle the debt. "Let them come," she said, her voice hard as flint. "I'm tired of hiding in the kitchen." The heavy silence of the bistro was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the frantic rhythmic chirping of Nia's burner phone. She pulled it from her pocket, her heart sinking as she saw a video message from an unknown number. The footage was grainy, illuminated by the harsh, orange flicker of sodium lamps. It showed Mrs. O tied to a rusted chair, her red coat torn and dusty, her eyes wide with a terror that bypassed Nia's skin and settled deep in her marrow. Behind the elderly woman, the dark silhouette of a man held a jagged blade to her throat. He didn't speak. He simply pointed the camera toward a shipping container marked with a faded White Dragon sigil. In the background, the rhythmic metallic clanging of a shipyard echoed, the Red Hook docks. "They have her," Nia whispered, the screen reflecting in her widened pupils. "The council didn't just want the ledger. They want to bury the witness." Taekwon's face went pale, his jaw tightening until the muscles corded. "It's a trap, Nia. My uncle knows you'll come. He knows that your father's greatest weakness was his heart, and he's betting everything that you inherited it." "It's not a weakness," Nia snapped, her voice trembling with a cold, focused rage. "It's the reason he was better than all of you." They reached the docks within 20 minutes, the SUV screaming through the industrial wasteland of South Brooklyn. The air here was thick with the scent of salt, rotting wood, and diesel. Huge cranes loomed over them like skeletal giants, and the fog rolling off the Atlantic turned the maze of shipping containers into a graveyard of steel. Taekwon checked his weapon, his eyes darting to the shadows. "The council elders have their own private security, mercenaries who don't follow the old codes. If we walk in there, we're walking into a kill zone." "I'm not walking in," Nia said, her voice dropping into that low melodic register of the Royal Guard. She reached into her bag and pulled out a pair of tactical gloves she had kept from her father's old kit. "I'm going to become a ghost again." She moved with a terrifying fluid grace, scaling a stack of containers before Taekwon could even protest. From the heights, she looked down at the clearing where a single spotlight hit the chair where Mrs. O sat. Dozens of men in tactical gear were positioned in the shadows, their rifles trained on the entrance. It was a perfect pincer movement, designed to shred anyone who entered through the front. Nia didn't look at the guns. She looked at Mrs. O, who was praying silently, her lips moving in a desperate rhythm. Nia felt a surge of something ancient and powerful rising within her. A protector's instinct that had been dormant for a decade. She wasn't just a waitress anymore, and she wasn't just a survivor. She was the daughter of the Black Lion, and the council was about to learn that some ghosts don't stay dead. Wait for my signal, Nia whispered into the comms unit she had taken from the safe house. Below, a car door slammed. Taekwon's uncle stepped into the light, his silk suit looking grotesque against the grime of the docks. Come out, little lion, he shouted, his voice echoing off the steel. Give us the ledger, and maybe the old woman lives to see tomorrow. Nia crouched at the edge of the container, a flashbang in one hand and a combat knife in the other. She didn't respond with words. She let the darkness swallow her, moving toward the first guard with the silent, predatory intent of a storm about to break. Would you like me to proceed to Chapter 8? The Lion and the Dragon, where the final battle begins. The flashbang Nia dropped didn't just blind the men in the clearing. It shattered the reality they thought they controlled. As the white light seared the darkness, Nia descended from the shipping container like a shadow given form. She didn't use a gun. She used the lion strike. A blur of palm heels and pressure point collapses that sent the first two mercenaries to the gravel before they could even blink back the spots in their eyes. Taekwon moved in perfect synchronization from the opposite flank. He wasn't the hesitant architect now. He was a man reclaiming his heritage, his movements sharp and lethal as he cleared the path toward the center of the trap. They fought with a terrifying wordless rhythm. Nia the agile shield, Taekwon the heavy sword. Protect the woman, the uncle screamed, scrambling backward into the darkness as his perimeter crumbled. A wall of mercenaries recovered, forming a gauntlet of steel between the rescuers and the chair where Mrs. O sat. Nia felt a bullet graze her shoulder, the heat of it a sharp reminder of the cost of her failure. She didn't flinch. She caught Taekwon's eye across the chaos. In that split second, the centuries of blood oaths and secret training converged. They stepped back to back, a circle of defiance in the heart of the shipyard. Nia took the low line, her legs sweeping out the foundation of any man who drew near, her hands striking with the archaic precision of the royal guard. Taekwon covered the high line, his strength providing the anvil to her hammer. 20 years, Nia shouted over the ring of steel and the roar of the Atlantic, her voice switching into the high, commanding Korean that echoed off the metal walls. 20 years you hunted my father for a truth you couldn't bury. She broke through the final line, a flurry of strikes disarming the man holding the knife to Mrs. O's throat. With a roar of effort, Taekwon intercepted a final attacker, his fist connecting with a sickening crunch. The clearing fell into a jagged, breathing silence, save for the distant sound of police sirens and the lapping of the tide. Nia dropped to her knees beside Mrs. O, her hands trembling as she sliced through the zip ties with her combat knife. I've got you, she whispered, her voice finally breaking. I've got you, Amma. The elderly woman collapsed into Nia's arms, sobbing into the stained apron that still bore the scent of the bistro. Taekwon stood over them, his chest heaving, his knuckles split and bleeding. He looked down at the ledger lying in the dirt, the evidence that would dismantle his family's dark empire, and then at Nia. He didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who had finally cleared the ground for a new foundation. The lion and the dragon had fought their way through the gauntlet, and for the first time in 2 decades, the debt wasn't written in blood. It was written in the way Taekwon stood guard over the 2 women, refusing to let the shadows take them again. The trap had been set for a waitress, but it had been sprung by a queen. The purge of the white dragon was not a spectacle of gunfire, but a quiet surgical dismantling. Armed with the ledger and the flash drives Nia had recovered, Taekwon did what he had always dreamed of doing. He became an architect of change. He used the truth to systematically dismantle the Council of Elders, turning the evidence over to the few remaining honest corners of the law, and freezing the syndicate's blood-soaked assets. The Shadow Council fell not to a blade, but to the weight of their own recorded sins. 6 months later, the air in Brooklyn carried the sweet, sharp scent of spring rain and sautéed garlic. The yellow police tape was a distant memory, replaced by a freshly painted sign that hung above the door of the renovated bistro. It no longer read the Gilded Crane. In simple, bold lettering, it now bore the name The Protector's Hearth. Inside, the light was warm and golden, reflecting off polished wood and clean glass. Mrs. O moved through the dining room in a new red coat, her face creased with a permanent, peaceful smile as she set down bowls of steaming juk. Nia stood behind the counter, her black uniform crisp, her movements still possessing that lethal grace, but the tension had finally left her shoulders. She was no longer practicing invisibility, she was practicing presence. The bell above the door chimed, a bright silver sound that cut through the low hum of jazz and conversation. Nia didn't need to look up to know who it was. The air in the room didn't chill with fear, and the diners didn't drop their voices in a panicked hush. Yoon Taekwon stepped into the restaurant. He wasn't wearing a $1,000 silk suit or a predatory scowl. He wore a simple navy sweater and dark jeans, his hands tucked into his pockets. The heavy weight of the white dragon air had been replaced by the quiet ease of a man who had spent his months liquidating a criminal empire into a legitimate foundation for urban development. He stopped at the counter, his dark eyes meeting Nia's. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. Two survivors of a war that had spanned generations. The blood debt was gone, replaced by something much more complicated and infinitely more beautiful. "Table for one?" Nia asked, her voice soft, carrying the melody of the royal court dialect, but this time it was used to welcome, not to command. Taekwon smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Actually, I was hoping for a seat at the chef's table. I hear the woman who runs this place is quite formidable." Nia felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the stoves. She reached under the counter and pulled out a menu, sliding it toward him. "She is. And she doesn't take kindly to people who try to pay with anything other than honesty." Taekwon pulled out a chair and sat down, not as a boss, but as a man seeking a new beginning. As Nia turned to the stove to prepare his meal, she realized that the circle had finally broken. Her father's sacrifice hadn't just saved a life. It had paved the way for this moment of peace. Somewhere in the quiet corners of the city, the ghosts of two men, one black and one Korean, looked at their children and finally rested. The fire was no longer for burning. It was for the hearth. And for the first time in her life, Nia Calder was home.